So I have a bit of a weird ancient DOS game today, as we're taking a look at the cinematic adventure slash puzzle slash rail shooter slash walking simulator hybrid known as Cyberia. Now, I'd heard extremely polarized things about this game prior to grabbing a copy for sake of covering on the show, and now that I've played through the game, I fully understand why the game comes across perfectly fine to some people and as total tripe to others. Because it's kind of both at the same time. This is a bit difficult to explain, but it's like every aspect of the game is done both really well and really badly at the same time. And I don't mean that there's a mix of good and bad aspects, rather each individual aspect of the game is both good and bad simultaneously. For instance, the graphics in the game are, for the most part, exceptionally well done, so long as it doesn't involve human beings, as every person in the game moves and looks like a ragdoll assembled out of basic 3D shapes. In that way, the graphics are both good and bad simultaneously. Now, I'm going to try to summarize my thoughts on this game as succinctly as I can, but the basic gist is that this game is very atypical, and thus if you go into it with any sort of preconceptions or expectations, it's almost certainly going to let you down. If, however, you can adapt to its incredibly unusual nature, then you'll find it has a lot of clever aspects to it buried under its surface, not enough to raise it to a point of a general recommendation, but enough that if you find what you see interesting over the course of the review, then it may indeed be worth trying out. But there are definitely a ton of things to be aware of before you go spending cash on this.
Rerouting fire control systems to manual operation. Target acquired.
Cyberia was the very first game developed by Xatrix Entertainment, the same company which went on to make the Redneck Rampage games, and then ultimately shut down the same day their last game, Kingpin, hit store shelves, and was published by Interplay around the start of 1994, which is actually a fair point to keep in mind in terms of the graphics, because this was still the early days of pre-rendered 3D visuals. Now, as for the genre, the game itself calls itself a quote arcade/adventure game, but that's kind of a misnomer since the arcade genre presupposes that there's going to be scoring, which there only is in very specific sections. Thus, a cinematic action/adventure makes more sense, though still doesn't hit all the points in terms of what this game does. In terms of video, it only supports VGA 320x200 56 color graphics, and in terms of audio, it only supports Sound Blaster cards. Now, as for its current release state, it may still be commercial, but it's a very easy game to get on all fronts. If you want a quick and easy digital copy, they can be grabbed from either GOG or Steam for $10. But this is one of the very few cases where physical copies can actually be cheaper than digital copies. Loose CDs will literally go for around half that cost, about $5, and even fully boxed and sealed copies aren't all that pricey, with fully boxed being around $15 to $20 and even sealed copies being around $25 to $40. They're not even remotely rare either. Well, at least provided you want the DOS version. The game was released on numerous platforms, not just DOS, but every single other release came at least a full year after the DOS original. Thus, there's fewer copies of those out there, and they tend to be more expensive when you do find them. Now, based on how the DOS version plays though, I would recommend sticking with DOS, unless you're simply collecting for specific platforms, as I can't imagine certain aspects of this game translating over to a D-pad very well.
Your contact is Santos. There's a TF-22 prepped and ready.
I've never flown a TF-22.
Not to worry, you won't be flying this one. The auto-nav is set to take you by optimum route to the Cyberia complex.
Trust is a wonderful thing.
I got you out of solitary, didn't I?
Yep, skipping the story section because there's virtually nothing to say about it. You play the role of a character named Zack, spelled Z-A-K, who was pulled from prison to help an old quote-unquote friend clean up a secret project gone bad which few people know about. Well, this project, known as Cyberia, was being conducted in a remote part of Russia and didn't end when the initial breakthroughs were made, leading to the researchers making more and more breakthroughs way too fast, and then one of those breakthroughs got out of hand, contaminated half of the base, and now a hostile force known as the Cartel is trying to swoop in and steal the secrets as well. Yeah, the story's a bit of a mess, to put it mildly, though I do find it amusing that literally no one in the game could be considered a good guy. Pretty much everyone, even the main character, is a bad guy. Also, there's so many plot holes, you'd think the game was carved out of a block of Swiss cheese or something. Anyways, when you first boot the game, you have to enter your name, as this tracks your progress for when you return to the game later, and then you have to select your difficulty levels. Now I will admit, it's neat that they separate out the action and puzzle difficulties like this, but there's one little problem. You're not allowed to select easy for both options at the same time. Now, you can have easy action, or easy puzzles, but not both, which is an incredibly user-hostile thing to do, all things considered. Though, granted, there's not really all that many puzzles in the game. None of them are randomized, they all have the same solutions. There are at least different solutions for each of the 3 skill settings. And as for the action sequences, this setting barely makes much of a difference at all, seeing as all it does is make the hitboxes larger or smaller for the things that you have to shoot. Initially, the game starts with Zack being sent to an ocean rig of sorts, where it's been arranged to provide him access to a TF-22 transfighter, which unfortunately is not pastel-colored, but is essentially a well-armed flying vehicle, capable of transforming between straight flight and hover modes. But first, Zack has to actually find his way to the boss. This brings us to the main controls of the game, which are unusual. Rather than having standard movement controls to walk around an entire scene, the game has fixed nodes that Zack can walk between. Now, while at a node, you can press the left and right keys to rotate Zack to face a nearby node that he can walk to. You press up to move Zack in the direction he's facing or to utilize something he's looking at. And while walking towards a node, the down arrow reverses Zack back the way he came. You can also press spacebar to attempt to fire your gun, though it takes a moment to aim, and thus if an enemy already has you in their sights, they're just going to shoot you before you can shoot back. The controls also get a little weird when combat is a thing. Now, outside of the main action sequences, it's possible to end up in a gunfight with one or more people. When this happens, the controls no longer have any consistency, as you'll often have to press left or right to enter or exit cover, but may use up or down instead, and if there's multiple targets, left or right may also end up turning Zack to face those targets, while spacebar is always the fire button. It's a bit of a mess, and you're going to end up having to replay these gunfights multiple times as a result of all this. Fortunately, for the most part, death is kinda inconsequential. The thing is, the game is all trial and error. You do a thing, and if you fail, you die, and you do it over. The game is very aware of this, and thus is keeping track of what it refers to as milestones, which in reality is just a multitude of autosaves for each critical point you reach through the game. Plus, if you fail an action sequence in particular, you can immediately do it over without having to reload one of these milestones. While this is definitely a welcome feature, it takes saving completely out of the hands of the player, and while most milestones are set up in spots which make sense, there's one part nearing the end of the game where you have to survive 3 enemy encounters in a row to get from one checkpoint to the next, with significant lore and backtracking between those 3 encounters. It literally took me nearly an hour to figure out how to clear this one tiny segment, whereas most of the game is not this ridiculous. Which isn't to say there aren't ridiculous things, far from it. I mean, take this instance, for example, where you're inspecting your TF-22 before boarding. You can walk past the inspection node to a node behind the aircraft, and normally that node only links to one other node, back to where you came from. But if you decide to have Zack keep walking forward, he will indeed absent-mindedly just walk right off the landing platform. Or, near the end of the game, there's a moment where you sit down at a computer terminal and take command of a special drone you're going to use to zap things in the contaminated area. Normally, you just watch it boot up and everything proceeds as expected. But if you start pressing the spacebar hoping to advance things quicker because of how long this sequence takes, the game's like, oh, you want to fire the drone's guns right now while it's pointing at Zack's legs? Sure! And zap! Bye-bye leg. More seriously though, I think the most ridiculous thing this game has going for it is just the fact that success or failure often comes down to split-second timing. At this part here, trying to go through the front entrance to the base for the Cyberia project, there's a guy constantly shooting his gun. If you time it so that you take aim as soon as a shot whizzes past, you're going to get hit by the next shot. You literally have to time it so that you're already halfway into coming out of hiding when that shot whizzes past in order to have enough time to shoot back. Going through the back entrance isn't any safer, as you have to time a jump through a massive fan blade and then make it through a series of rooms with a noise so loud and brain-busting that it kills Zack if he stays in it for too long, and the timing to make it through to the other side is so tight, I almost thought it was impossible. One saving grace, though, is that the game is not checking for newly pressed keys, simply if a key is held down or not. Because of this, if you know the exact sequence of actions to take to survive something, you don't have to wait to press the right keys at the right times. You can press the first key you need, hold it down until its effect is triggered, then immediately hold down the next key you need to press to have it follow suit. While this isn't generally the way you would consciously perform actions in a game like this, if you can get yourself in the necessary mindset to buffer your key holding in this manner, you'll have a much easier time surviving the more difficult parts. Which gets you treated to witnessing more of some of the most ridiculous storytelling and voice acting ever. For instance, the first thing you do in the game is help defend the ocean rig you reach from a cartel invasion force. This action sequence is fairly long, lasting 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and is the only one in the entire game where you can't use the mouse to control where you're aiming. Though it's definitely one of the easiest, as you have a lot of shields and a lot of energy. Though if you do take an unshielded hit, the turret gets damaged and won't turn as well. Following this, the character who greeted you at gunpoint and was ready to shoot you now wants you to kiss her? What? And if you decide to do so, or let the game decide to do so for you, it makes the security operator jealous and they zap you out, take you hostage, and then they die, and now you have to escape from this rig while being gunned down by its staff. But if you instead turn sideways when asked for the kiss, you'll decline and everything proceeds normally without having to gun down half the staff. You see what I mean when I say nobody in this game is a good guy? Now, in terms of the puzzles, there's only a handful of them throughout the game, and again, they're not randomly generated, so the solution is the same every time, though there are different solutions depending on the puzzle difficulty chosen. However, most puzzles cannot be solved simply by looking at them. Instead, you need to scan the thing you're looking at. Now, you have 3 kinds of scans you can perform: infrared, magnetic resonance, and biomass. If infrared signatures are present, the strength of those signatures will be indicated. Magnetic resonance basically lets you see inside what you're looking at and identifies any noteworthy components, while the biomass scan is practically worthless, as I don't believe there's a single instance in the entire game where you absolutely need to perform one to succeed at a puzzle. Well, there's also technically a limit to how many scans you can do, but they come up so infrequently that you should always be fully recharged before having to do more scans. Lastly though, we have the action sequences. Now these are essentially rail shooters, where the goal is to take out as many highlighted targets as possible, while sometimes avoiding certain kinds of targets. The TF-22 has energy levels for its main guns, which recharges fairly quickly, a shields gauge, which also recharges, and hull damage, which does not recharge until you clear an area. While later action sequences often won't visually show any indicators like this, but tend to have similar logic. Now, just like with everything else, these sequences boil down to trial and error, and many of them will be nearly impossible until you know exactly what's going to happen and where you should be aiming at each moment. Part of the reason why you can't just simply react to everything and succeed is because the frame rate of these sequences is locked to 12.5 frames per second, which is kind of a weird frame rate to see from a North American developer. But the mouse cursor is also locked to this frame rate, making it incredibly difficult to move the mouse to where you want it to be. Now sure, there's joystick and keyboard controls too, but these don't really work any better, and still update at only 12.5 frames per second. Thus, a lot of your failures in these sequences will simply come down to the poor frame rate as opposed to legitimate difficulty. One thing it's easy to miss though, because it's a game mechanic which is explained in-universe, and is the only such mechanic explained as such, and very late in the game even, has to do with the second last action sequence in the contaminated area, where you have to take out nanites which have learned to rebuild themselves into quote-unquote small killing machines. Now once the contaminated area is opened up to send the probe inside, if even just a single one of these nanite machines makes it past the probe, it'll kill you. Thus, if and when you let a nanite machine slip by, an alert will show up, and you have only a second or two to activate a special shockwave with the Enter key, which zaps away all nanite machines found around the probe in one fell swoop, at the cost of a sizable amount of energy. You can do the shockwave even without an alert state, but seeing as you have a very limited amount of energy to make it through this entire sequence, you want to avoid using this shockwave as much as possible. About the last thing to say really is just a small, very specific tip if you decide to play this game for yourself. Normally, you can tell fairly easily which direction Zack is facing at every node, though oftentimes it doesn't matter anyways. However, There's one node in the Cyberia complex where Zack is barely more than a handful of pixels tall on the screen, yet this is a three-way node. Thus, it's very easy to miss that this is even a thing, and even once you realize it's a thing, trying to turn to face the specific direction you want to move in is a bit of a chore, since pretty much there's no way to discern which way Zack is facing. Overall, Cyberia is more of a tech demo than a legitimate gaming experience. What's on offer here is impressive in terms of the tech driving it, but everything else is a bit of a mess. As such, I would say this is more so a game to try out if the visual aesthetic is appealing, as opposed to the raw gameplay, since the raw gameplay itself is nothing to write home about, and the story is about as contrived and pointless as it gets. But despite all of that, the frustration factor is minimal despite how often you'll see that game over screen due to how little progress you lose on most occasions, and you do have some control over the difficulty of the game, even if it's barely any. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a way to keep the game audio from routinely skipping a beat, making me wonder if this was even a DOSBox emulation issue or if the game itself has issues with the audio playback. But regardless, this means if you leave cycle set to auto, the game will play back about as well as it can. Using max or fixed cycles count instead doesn't really help any. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on May 20th will be another review, episode 313. Where we're going to be taking a look back at a racing game which I can't really give any big hints towards because it'd be too obvious, except to say that it's based on a real-life racing competition. So be sure to stay tuned to see which one it is which got turned into a DOS game.
Contamination eliminated.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the folks shown here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show directly and see your name here as well, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.